Welcome to the ChargePoint podcast, brought to you by Flexecharge, your gateway to the future of EV charging. In each episode, we dive deep into the world of EV infrastructure, offering insights and perspectives from industry leaders, innovators, and the people at the forefront of deploying charging solutions and networks. Join us to explore the exciting developments that are accelerating our world towards sustainable mobility.
Welcome to an episode of the ChargePoint podcast. I'm your host, Christophe, and I'm from Flexecharge. You've just plugged into episode 20, the first in a new series of conversation focused entirely on one of the most critical yet often overlooked pieces of the electrification puzzle, depot and fleet charging. So let me ask you, when you think about EV charging, do you picture a highway, suburb, or a quiet urban depot? What's actually harder, building fast charging hubs for public use or figuring out how to juice up 50 trucks overnight from a single grid connection? And if you're a fleet operator or a CPO, where should your next big infrastructure bet go? We're launching this series to dig deep into these questions and to spotlight the people working on real-world electrification where it gets complex at the depot. In this kickoff episode, I'm joined by two guests bringing serious expertise to the table. First up, Casper Norden, CEO of Decade Energy, a company literally born out of the need to electrify trucks depot at scale. Casper shares his journey from startup land to developing infrastructure for logistics giants like DB Schenker. He asks the hard questions too, like how do we bring power to places it's never been needed before? And how do we do it without breaking the grid or the business case? Then we get grounded with David Watts from Pelican Engineering Group, a man with nearly 3 decades of fleet experience. From vans to 44-ton trucks, he's seen the shift from diesel to electric firsthand. What's stopping fleets from going all in? Spoiler, it's not just the cost of the vehicle. It's also about the energy. This episode sets the stage, but there is more to come. In the next weeks and months, we'll hear from grid experts, OEM innovators, energy strategists, or other leaders in the fleet electrification movement, so stay tuned. But for now, let's get this series rolling. Are we ready to electrify where it matters most at the depot? Let's find out. Welcome to the first guest on this episode about depot and fleet charging. Super exciting topic that I've been looking forward to covering for some time. And great guest to start with today, Casper Norden from Decade Energy. Welcome, Casper.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for taking the time to sit in the hot seat. So as usual, let's get straight to your origins story, as I call it. So take us as far back as you would like. Tell us a bit what led you to be today the CEO of Decade Energy.
Yeah, great question. So from a personal point of view, it's actually fun. I started studying architecture in university, and I realized quite quickly that I like building things. And unfortunately for architects, I think they're not get to build enough. And so I made a life pivot, you can say, and I went to business school and to a school where I think, Stockholm School of Economics, which is very entrepreneurial. And I fell in love with building companies instead. And so I've dabbled in startups my whole life. I spent quite a lot of time at an AI company called Peltarion, which I think was before its time on LLMs and those kind of things. Mm-hmm. And that business was then eventually sold to King, the guys behind Candy Crush, and which has been absorbed by Microsoft. Which is interesting now that you're kind of reading about all of that stuff. But as I shifted out of that business, I was lucky enough. I come from a family of entrepreneurs. So my father, Carl Magnus, is a serial entrepreneur. And at that time, everybody was hearing about Tesla, electrification of passenger vehicles. And he was looking at what was happening with trucks. And he saw that, virtually nothing was happening. And we're both Swedes, originally from Sweden. And so we have two very nice OEMs there, Scania and Volvo. And so we spoke to them. And we got from those conversations that basically, nothing was happening, which was both distressing because we are, believers in the challenges of climate change. And if you look in most European countries, transport is about 20% of emissions, and commercial vehicles, kind of trucks, is half of that. So 10% of total emissions is trucks. So that was distressing, but also, we flipped the coin and said, this is a massive opportunity for us.
When was that?
So this was in 2018, 2019. So basically we felt that there's no trucks, no electric trucks kind of coming out. And, in the OEM business, you have pretty good line of sight. Like if there's a program starting in 6-7 years, there will be something coming out. So we said, okay, there's an opportunity here for us to build an electric truck. And the more we also got into, the problem solving or the problems in the industry, we found out that not only is decarbonization, an issue, but there were other systemic issues around, driver health. So, there's a massive driver shortage, and it has a lot to do with that. The way the cabs are designed, it's not a good working environment for drivers, basically. And then also there's a lot of blind spots, the way these trucks are designed, that kills a lot of, pedestrians, but primarily cyclists in big cities. And when we then started to design a truck from the ground up for electric, we also had the opportunity to address some of those issues. And I think we were naive in the sense that, like you should be as an entrepreneur,
I was about to say, if you're not naive, you're not changing the world.
You should be a bit naive. And I think we said, what's the difference between buying a diesel truck versus an electric truck? So we went on to build an electric truck, and turns out big differences, right? So a lot of ancillary problems, starting off with how to buy an electric vehicle, how to lease an electric vehicle, how to insure an electric vehicle. Then we got into questions from our customers around charging infrastructure. How do I get the power to my site? Yeah. And then, all of the after sales business. And so I became responsible over time then for developing products or solutions for those ancillary problems, all the way from purchasing to how to operate a vehicle smoothly when it's delivered. And we bundled kind of all of those different solutions into a concept that we called truck as a service. And we were lucky with Volta Trucks to land a couple of big strategic customers, Petrofossi and DB Schenker, were two really big fish. And they wanted to really accelerate the electrification of their fleets. So they committed to buying large volumes, thousands of trucks. And then the question quickly became, where should we put these trucks? Because they have hundreds of depots. And so that then kind of fell on me. So my team, we went out to over 500 depots, not only for these two customers, but for many customers, and looked at where can they receive trucks and where can they operate them, basically. So we went out to those depots. We looked at what type of fleet did they have, what type of customers did they serve, what electrical infrastructure did they have, and then we kind of built an electrification roadmap, you could almost say, together with them. And Decade Energy is really sprung out of those insights, if you will. And kind of fast forwarding a couple of years, I think we are now in a situation where supply of trucks is not really. It's still an issue, but it's not. There are models coming out and so on. So I think the next problem for this industry to decarbonize and to electrify is to get a lot of electricity into the right places, and that place is the depot. Yeah. And to consume that in an efficient way, so you kind of make electric competitive to diesel and really an alternative. Yeah. So we're all about depots, and that's why we've named our company Decade, which stands for short for decarbonizing depots.
Ah, yeah, I was about to ask about the branding. Okay, decarbonizing depots, yeah. So you phrase it a little bit, but let's just put it really straight. So give us the pitch about Decade Energy. What do you do? Which role do you play in the EV charging ecosystem?
Yeah, so Decade Energy we're a developer of electrical infrastructure for depots, you can say. We develop, finance and operate infrastructure in depots to enable the electrification of transportation. And kind of the picture that we that we talk about internally. We have a vision slide of the depot of the future, and it's got a couple of infrastructure components in there that you usually don't have today. PV panels, charging infrastructure, big grid connection, trucks as well. And so how do we kind of enable those things to get into the depots, and how do we enable them to be run as one unit to kind of make the whole operation efficient? And that's kind of what we are about.
Clear, yeah. So you're not selling any kilowatt hours. You are really helping to set up the infrastructure for those who will run the depot and consume electricity, which is, of course, a major component here. Yeah. Clear. Yeah. Thanks for this clarification. So when we talk about fleet electrification or decarbonization of transport, which is picking a pace, totally agree with you globally. We see that, and Europe is in a good position. We can come back to the big perspective. So can you help us to draw the major challenges that depot and fleet operators face when they want to make this move, which you described?
Yeah. Maybe, Christophe, just to kind of jump a little bit back to also what it is that we do. So we can cater to all of those different infrastructures, but really what we help our customers with today mainly is helping them to get secure enough power to their site, so to do grid upgrades. And then we couple that with an innovative financing solution that entails essentially battery storage to lower the investment hurdle. And so kind of, we almost call it a free electrification insurance, if you will. So it doesn't really matter when you're going to go electric, but at least with us, you know that you have the power that you need for when you want to go electric. And that brings me maybe a little bit into the challenges, right? So I think, broadly speaking, there's kind of 4 buckets. The first one is cost. Electric vehicles today, historically have been much more expensive than the diesel equivalent. And there's been subsidies and so forth, but I think, we have line of sight of that kind of coming down. But regardless of cost, even if cost is better in the electric world, kind of it's not evenly spread like with diesel. And so you have large upfront cash flow kind of investment barriers. And for a transportation industry that has low margins, that is a real issue. Then obviously getting the right infrastructure into the depot, there's a lot of new technological choice decisions that have to be made that transporters, are not fit and shouldn't be fit to decide. And the people who have, I think, wanted to be leaders and, take some of those decisions themselves, unfortunately, I think have often kind of made stumbled a little bit. But I think one thing that I think is overlooked is the challenge that, electric vehicles bring operational challenges. You're going to have to change. You can't do exactly what you've been doing before in terms of workflows. And I think that is probably one of the biggest kind of issues, to be honest, because it's low profit margins means, very lean machines that have been optimized for decades. And that is kind of, changing now. So, but those are what I would say kind of the 4 buckets that as you see them.
Clear. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So if we maybe compare a bit to another area which is maybe a bit more ahead in terms of electrification, which is the public hubs for personal transportation, right? So if we compare, let's talk a bit about the depot charging versus public charging. So according to you, so how do you see depot charging differing from public charging? Maybe in terms of infrastructure needs, cost, operational efficiency. So how do you see that?
Well, it will always be a discussion for us to have, because I think this is an area. I mean, I understand depots very well. I understand public a little bit less, but I do see some differences that I hear about when I speak with our customers and generally kind of partners in the ecosystem. I would say that the first thing is predictability in consumption. So I think depot is similar to buses. More, where you have quite predictable consumption patterns. I mean, in buses, it can't get more predictable because you have the timetables, when the trucks are, or when the buses are out and when they're in the depot and where they're going to be, etc. But depots are kind of similar in the sense that they follow a certain pattern that is there for different reasons. And so you kind of know when consumption is going to be and how much is going to be consumed. Whereas I think in certain areas, from what I hear, in public spaces, consumption is less predictable, maybe also more variable. And so those, I think, are challenges. And how does that translate then for challenges for the industry? Well, if you're looking to finance public spaces, there's traffic risk, essentially, right? What are the revenue streams going to be? And then I think from an infrastructure perspective, you are going to size the infrastructure you want to be on the safe side, so you're going to, dimension for peak consumption. And so I think, we've seen some over-dimensioning, I would say, in the past. And that can be solved with battery storage and other things. And I'm sure that, people like you guys are also, developing smart solutions for how to address those. But I think historically, that's what you've seen. Then I think maybe on the charger side, it's also difficult to know because technology is changing so fast. But it wouldn't surprise me that in depots you will have kind of, relatively speaking, slower fast chargers than maybe you would do in public spaces, because trucks and vans, will sleep in depots, for a long time, in many instances. So they don't need really that megawatt hour charging or whatever it is. No. But at the same time, you're going to have that destination chargers. So you're charging scenarios. So, trucks are going to come into depots, offload, and then, go back to where they're coming from. And they're probably going to need faster charging and, more powerful stuff.
Yeah. So it's two parallel disciplines. Absolutely. Yeah. I agree with your observations. Yeah. And if you look at the past few years, what you've been seeing, discussing with the customers, going on the path of electrifying their fleet and installing depot charging, what have been some of the maybe most common mistakes that they've made going down this path?
So first of all, I think that people, before kind of going to mistakes, I think, generally, I think the narrative around electrification is an interesting one where, you want to wait and see, et cetera, et cetera. I think this is a fundamental shift. And do you want to be a leader in that? I think there's a massive opportunity in learning early, carefully and smart, but going into this because this is where things are heading, and there's just massive opportunity lying in there. So I would encourage people to jump into this sooner rather than later. But if you look at kind of some of the, I think mistakes or things that people haven't really considered is depot charging and trucks, commercial vehicles are different from passenger cars. The way they operate primarily. And also from a technology standpoint, and kind of the use cases are different. So what I've seen some people do is lean too much on partners that, really have a passenger car background, and that maybe don't really see the difference between trucks, light commercial vehicles, and commercial vehicles, and the history that they have in passenger cars. And, you basically... It's smooth because you copy paste, but if you paste into a completely new environment, often it's not going to meet the same needs. So I think it's beneficial to work with somebody who understands more this world, and who is building product for that. And it can be very simple. Like I've trucks primarily charge with 800 volt. Equipment. So I've seen many cases where people install 400 volts. A lot of different chargers of 400 volt, and suddenly, that's not going to work. But also, I think the software usually that comes with these passenger car technologies is not really adapt to the business or the world of a commercial setting. So I would. And it's been difficult. I think in the past there weren't people who were focusing on commercial vehicles and trucks, so you couldn't find it. But I think increasingly people are looking into that. So my tip would be to try to work with somebody who shows an interest in the business that you're running and is developing product for that specific case.
Yeah, klar. It's as the electrification progresses, it calls for specializations and deep knowledge and skills which are different. Absolutely, yeah. I agree. Yeah. So when we talk about depot charging, we talk about massive energy needs, right? So I think one of our favorite topics, Flexecharge, is grid congestion, grid challenges.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about grid challenges and energy management. Grid constraints are clearly a major concern for high power charging, and with places like Holland being a total in gridlock almost to deploy new. There's previous episodes we covered or webinars about that for those who are curious. So, but how do you guys at Decade Energy address the issue of grid constraint? How much have you met it? Because I guess it depends also a bit on the markets where you're present. Maybe you didn't mention. Can we just take it on which market are you working today or looking at working?
So we are present in the Nordics and in France, but we primarily focus on France. To be honest, this is where we have the majority of our traction and customers. And so I think we're really building a strong offering for that market. And I would say similar to Sweden, we have in France a situation where the grid, to be honest, is like the low points is quite strong because you've heated your homes with not with gas basically. So so the general level of the grid is okay if you don't compare to the Netherlands, which is more is a scary scenario. But I think your problem statement is absolutely right, that grid connections, or the grid is scarce, going to be an increasingly scarce asset. It's costly, and most of all, it can take a lot of time to get the right grid connection. And so even though the situation is not as acute as in the Netherlands, you're starting to see the grid in France, increasingly acknowledge that this is going to be, is an issue, and is going to be a bigger issue. So they are implementing a lot of different initiatives and, tariff structures, and etc., to incentivize people to be more smart about this. And this is both an opportunity and, a risk for our customers. And we usually talk to customers about that, when it comes to the grid in France, it's kind of a first come, first serve. So think about this now. And even if you would be in the happy position where maybe, your site is in used to be an old train station or something, and so you have a massive cable coming into the site, there's legislation coming into effect now that means that if you don't consume the grid connection that you have, you're going to lose it because it's going to be distributed to somebody else. So this is something that, you have to think about now. And the way we have designed our business is that doesn't really have to come with a cost. It actually can be beneficial for you. We can pay you rent for helping you secure the grid connection that you need. So I think we are one of the businesses, but I'm sure that there's others also who are thinking about how can you deal with this issue. You have to deal with this issue now, but how can we kind of make that overcomable. I don't know if that's a word.
Yeah, but I hear you. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so you would go as far as kind of helping them to pay for the grid, to keep that grid instead of losing them, to avoid losing the right to use this power, because down the line they would need that power. That capacity. Yeah, really interesting. Yeah, but I guess, it helps. Thanks. We haven't made any deep dive on the French market yet, though I'm half French, so it would be quite natural, but it's in the future. And thanks for giving a bit of an insight, on the current state of the grid. Okay, yeah. So, clear. So, you mentioned a bit, again, one of our other favorite topics, BESS, battery energy storage systems. So many CPOs are looking now increasingly at battery BESS as a solution to peak demand charges. So how viable is this for Depot? What's what are you recommending your customers?
So I agree with you. There is a massive opportunity for BSS to play in these depots. And I think just to kind of, There's so many different use cases. We can talk forever about that, but the general premise is today, with an ambient depot, very little electricity is consumed. You're going to go, with just a couple of trucks, you go to a completely different world, basically. So you've got, changing demand. And then if you think a bit more high level, also, we're putting more and more renewables onto the grid, intermittent kind of production. And so you have variable production and kind of variable consumption. And batteries play a part in making those meet. So it could be everything from increasing self-consumption from PV that you may have on the big roofs to reducing the need for the sizing of the infrastructure because you shave peaks, to taking advantage of daily price patterns, right? You don't want to charge in the morning, you want to do that maybe overnight instead. And then through smart software, not only can you do that locally, but you can also use the best and when it's not being used by yourself to support the grid and generate new revenue streams, which is one of the important things that we do. And we use that to find kind of the revenues from that to finance the grid connection upgrades and so forth.
Yeah.
So BESS, I think, will play a very important role. And I think the reason why you're speaking about it so much now is that battery prices really have come down very quickly over the last 12 to 18 months.
Yes.
And so it used to be a luxury, but is now, really something that will be a central piece in the depth of the future as we see it.
Yeah. Again, here, a little political comment. I hope really that geopolitical, that we'll have a strong industry. It's such a shame that Northvolt is, and especially sorry for you as a fellow Swedish citizen that Northvolt is such a shame that they went bust. I hope that there will be successes, other best sub projects coming out of this because we need that. Yeah, absolutely. It's a super important part of the puzzle. Yeah. So to stick to the energy management area and to understand a bit your perspective. So you mentioned some cases. Anything else around there where you mentioned optimize the charging costs? What about dynamic load management? If we get a bit technical and detailed in terms of balancing the power available. Again, in France, as you said, plenty of capacity. So I guess not a big topic yet for you guys, for your depot customers.
I think, generally speaking, if you look at the industry, we are still at the deployment of assets stage. I think, yes, you're starting to see more and more charging infrastructure on public roads, but in depots, you've very little of that. You've very little BESS. You've got very little PV. So I think we're still, to be honest, primarily in that phase. But the natural evolution of that is obviously towards optimization. And I think as you deploy those assets, obviously need to look into the future for that as well. So we are very much focused on, the deployment of the assets, doing that, with smart financing solutions, but also building software to help optimize the way you consume. And, the first thing is to obviously consume smartly with the outside parameters out there, right? So the price of electricity. But I think in this case, in a commercial vehicle setting, there are opportunities to adapt the way you operate and consume electricity, basically. And so if a truck is sleeping in the depot for 10 hours, maybe it just needs to charge for half of that. You can optimize when it's going to charge. So there's a lot of opportunity for this.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think you're correct. I mean, it's exactly that penetration or this stage of development. It's exactly. I mean, we could see with dynamic load management on passenger vehicles, on supermarkets or any premises, the needs wasn't there for 4 or 5 years. Because again, if you put 2 chargers in a corner, right, and you have few cars coming, it's okay, you have the capacity. But it's really starting to really hurt now, and it starts to be clear that the need increases every day because again of the growth of the infrastructure, more chargers, the grid stays what it is. So I guess you're right. We'll see that the same on depot as the number of trucks, commercial vehicles, and the number of chargers on premises will increase. Then, of course, you'll have to deal with what you have, and thereby dynamic load management becomes a point.
Yes. Yeah. And I think if you abstract it a little bit, the kind of depot charging problem, the customer really only is interested in making sure that their trucks are available the next morning with the adequate charge. It doesn't have to be fully charged. Maybe it just needs to be half charged. It depends on the scheduled route. And they want to do that at the best possible cost to drive economics in the fleet. If you think about it that way, I mean, there's so much opportunity to charge different timings, or not charge full, or charge one truck more than the other, etc. So I think it's not about making sure that your truck is always charged fully, very fast in the trucking world. It's how do I make sure that my fleet, every morning is ready to work with the capacity that is needed, basically. Exactly. And there you will have software opportunities to check in, which is part of what we are doing, right? Is integrating with the fleet management systems, etc. So you start to understand, okay, how much do I need to charge? When do I need to be charged by? And so forth.
Absolutely, yeah. Makes sense, yeah. And if we talk about a bit of profitability and business models, given I think you alluded a couple of times to the way you work, but then you can come back to this. So given the pretty high upfront capex, right, for depot charging, so what financing options are available for depot and fleet operators looking to electrify? How do you see that?
So high level, I think that there is a lot of appetite to finance the transition, first of all. So I think the transition is a lot about finding good financing solutions and finding good financing partners. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to be very creative here, which I think, is one of the key things that we have done as a business, which is, we develop the infrastructure, we deal with, the investment funds and the banks who want to finance these things. We know what they are looking for to be able to do that. And then we develop a fully financed project to the customer. And then depending on what the customer can commit to, whether it's a certain amount of consumption or whether they want to pay a fixed monthly rent or et cetera, you can kind of, slice it and dice it a little bit how you want, depending on what the customer is willing to commit to. And we also see that, we're willing to work with kind of whatever financing partner is out there as well. It could be that, the landlord of the depot wants to deploy capex. Sometimes the transport operator itself can go and lend from a bank, or we have partnerships as well where we can be a more active partner and provide the financing. And I think one of the questions I know that we discussed ahead of this meeting was, why should people go for working with somebody, a provider of this financing? And I think it has to do primarily with that, professionals can size the risk that is inherent in a infrastructure deployment better probably than the transport operator can. And so I think that will translate also, if they do it, into lower cost, basically.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. So if we take our crystal ball a bit on the table now, I love to always end the conversation with a bit really looking, so you mentioned opportunities. Yeah, you say many opportunities. So let's go on innovations. So what innovations do you see shaping the future of depot charging in the next, as it's going to mature, right? And really rise 5-10 years, right? Another decade and beyond.
Yeah. So maybe I think it's important to look a little bit at kind of, let me look at the history of what has been happening to set a bit of context, and then maybe look a little bit into the future. As I mentioned, kind of, what tailwinds do we have? Well, battery costs have fallen 50% in 18 months. So obviously great for BESS, but also great for electric vehicles, where, in a truck, the only two real innovations compared to a diesel truck is that they have a battery and they have an electric powertrain. The electric powertrain is much simpler than a diesel engine. I don't know if you've seen the difference between them, but you're speaking thousands of parts versus kind of hundreds of parts. Yeah. So that should mean that this is, accelerating, but should also make it much cheaper in comparison. I think we're seeing a lot of improvements in new vehicles being launched, kind of, coming back to where we started earlier, that it's not really the supply of trucks anymore that's the big issue. And through all of those advancements, you're seeing, models being launched with so much more autonomy than they used to have. So maybe they can go, they only have to charge one time every second day or whatever it could be, right? Mm-hmm. So this is really coming fast. And then I spoke just this week to Emmanuel Depré, who is is leading the electromobility within business within Renault Trucks. And he said something which I struck a little bit with me, that they have been series producing trucks now, electric trucks, for 5 years. So I think you're also starting to see, when it comes to supply chain and manufacturing, that scale economies is really going to come now, because you've gone through the first piloting phases in manufacturing. I'm sure that their bill of materials, has been improved. The way that they've designed the vehicle is not only based on, design, but has now also been gone through optimization in the way that you manufacture for cost. Mm-hmm. So I think TCO parity is coming very much, and TCO superiority is very much coming through that. With that said, I go back to my earlier statement. I think innovation is going to happen a lot in the assets that are going to be deployed. I think this is really where the battle is right now. Mm-hmm. And our team just got actually back from a 10-day trip to China, where we saw kind of the next generation of batteries, and it's just amazing what's in the pipeline. So I think you will have much smarter hardware coming quickly. And just to give you an example, I think everything that is a problem right now, there are things being cooked up to address those. So when it comes to battery storage, fire obviously is a big concern, even though I think it's an overblown one. But a lot of new models coming out that specifically target how do you deal with the risk of fire. And then as increasingly you start to see this, I think there's going to be, I think almost the vision is quite clear for most people around, consuming electricity in a smart way and so forth. But you're going to see that coming very fast, I think. But a tip, I think, to anybody who's listening, is that if you're interested in electrification of transport of commercial vehicles, you should go to China, because it's really, the future is already there.
Can you imagine?
And what you see there, if you can replicate that here, I think we will be in a much, much better place.
Yeah. But you were discussing before the episode that you still feel that we have a good shot if we finish on the big macro perspective in Europe. How do you see our chances between the OEMs, between the energy mix, between the technology available? I mean, we got to get our own batteries also somehow, hopefully. But how do you see our chances? You say that we believe in Europe also here.
Well, I think we have to be realistic, and I think take a bit of a sinister analogy. If you think about war, somebody told me that it's always easy when you go to war to try to fight it as the last one. So I think we have to be pragmatic and say, and realistic. Okay, what is, can we win many of the things that China has already won? To be honest. But maybe that's okay. Maybe let's set our sights on the next challenge and use whatever has been produced so far to
exactly the economy of scale
on here.
So would the batteries be one where you say, look, don't fight too hard, let's just embrace those batteries and develop something else where we have an edge?
I think so. And I mean, if you look at competitive advantages between economies is often about, or I think in much extent boils down to the cost of energy that you can attain.
Yes.
Right. And this is an energy transition. And if we deploy a lot of batteries, if we do a lot of smart works on our grid, if we deploy smart software, I think there's a big chance that we will be able to dramatically reduce the cost of energy in this nation, or in this part of the world. And that will have massive effects on everything else, I think. So it's about, I think the energy transition is obviously about decarbonization, but it's very much also about building a competitive advantage for us here. Yeah. And that can be the foundation of a lot of very cool things.
Absolutely, yeah. Cool. Great, Casper. Thank you very much. On that note, again, for taking the time to be in the hot seat on the ChargePoint podcast. And looking forward to keeping in touch and following the progress. And wishing you a great afternoon.
Thanks for having me. Always great to talk about this.
Thank you.
Bye.
Welcome to this second part of this episode about depot and fleet charging. And now in the hot seat, I have David from Pelican Engineering. Welcome, David. Thank you for taking the time. So let's just straight into it. So can you please tell us your origins story that led you to where you are today at Pelican Engineering?
Sure. No, thanks. It's great to be here. So I've spent nearly 29 years in the fleet industry, primarily in the sort of company car and sort of van world, and a number of roles across a variety of different businesses. My journey into sort of sustainability and decarbonisation started back in 2006 when I joined the Energy Saving Trust, which essentially was a charity working on behalf of the Department for Transport, which was defining and leading the government's green fleet agenda. On decarbonisation, which very rapidly sort of moved into electrification. So when people tell me that electrification is difficult or fleet electrification is difficult, I like to sort of just give a bit of context that I was first talking to fleets about electric vehicles before the Nissan Leaf was launched, which was back in 2010. So when people say it's difficult, I say, well, you should have tried that conversation 16, 17 years ago. That's when it was difficult. Now it's it's not a piece of cake, but we've progressed an awful long way since I first started. I've had a variety of roles for a number of organisations, mainly in sort of consulting type pieces, developing electrification propositions for people. I spent a year with Arrival, the electric vehicle startup that unfortunately stopped starting up, but that was a great experience.
That's how it goes.
Yeah, in the last year, I've sort of moved into the truck world. So I spent a lot of time sort of cars and vans, and I moved into trucks because trucks is really where it's at in terms of the sort of real challenges facing the industry on electrification. And that's kind of where I've landed with Pelican Engineering at the beginning of this year to develop their new products and sell it to the world.
Exciting, yeah. So long journey and fantastic to have a professional with such a deep experience today on the show. So can you give us an introduction of to Pelican Engineering Group and what role the company plays in the ecosystem and what you
Sure.
do also?
So Pelican Engineering is actually a sort of 105-year-old family business, which is an interesting concept for me because I spent my life essentially with sort of large corporates and many sort of international corporates. So working for a family business is quite a different environment. Trucks is in their DNA. They're potentially the UK's oldest sort of truck dealership. They've got two truck dealerships. But more pertinent to this conversation is that they've been in partnership with Yutong, which is a Chinese global commercial vehicle manufacturer since 2015, and they've been supplying Yutong buses and coaches into the UK market. And more recently, they've moved into electric. So about 5-6 years ago, they started supplying electric buses and coaches into the UK market. And by the end of this year, they will have done in the region of 1,100 electric buses and coaches, which makes them, if not the largest, certainly one of the largest suppliers of electric buses and coaches into the UK market. And actually, if you put that into context for trucks, they will have supplied and supported more electric buses and coaches than all of the electric trucks combined by all the OEMs into the UK. So they've got a huge amount of experience in supplying and supporting large electric commercial vehicles. And off the back of that success, I am bringing a 7.5-ton electric truck to the market, which is a very exciting place to be.
Exciting, absolutely, yeah. Fleet electrification, we can agree, is picking up pace, right, globally. So let's dive into it. So what do you see are the key challenges that depot-bound, so commercial fleet operators face when transitioning to electric vehicle?
Sure. So if we're focusing on bound vehicles or depot-based vehicles, which arguably is more straightforward for a commercial vehicle operator to electrify because you haven't got the challenges of vehicles going home with the drivers, which you see with many vans. I guess Essentially, it falls into three categories. The challenges. The first is the driver. You've got to bring the driver along this journey, but that's a relatively small amount of your time in terms of where your focus is. Will the vehicle do what you need it to do? Is arguably the first challenge when you're selecting a vehicle and you're trying to replace like for like. Will it do what you need it to do? Will it carry what you need it to carry? And will it do the day's work on one charge? And if it doesn't do it on one charge, what do you need to do to enable it to sort of get that top up charging to enable it to do its day's job? Or will that day's job have to change? Operationally, will you have to change? That's for many vehicles. That's relatively straightforward. But the real challenge facing operators in this transition to electric is energy. It's power. How and where and when are you going to deliver the power into the vehicle to enable it to do the job that you need it to do? It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy to electrify one vehicle, and whether we're talking about vans or trucks, it's pretty easy to electrify one vehicle. Electrifying a fleet of vehicles out of one site becomes a whole different ball game, and particularly if you're talking larger trucks that have got very large batteries, and therefore the amount of power that's required for each individual vehicle, is exponentially different compared to sort of vans and small trucks. A van and a small truck can do a slow charge overnight on an 11 kilowatt charger quite happily, and just like charging a car.
Exactly.
If you're talking large trucks that have got sort of 500, 600 kilowatt hour batteries, then a slow charge is being done on a 40, 50 kilowatt charger, rapid charger in effect. For 10 hours to sort of fully charge. So if you then, but that in itself is relatively straightforward. But if you're then talking about 10 trucks or 20 trucks or 50 trucks operating out of that one site, that's an unbelievable amount of power. It's the sort of power that's required to sort of power a small town.
Yeah,
so the real challenge is how much power do you need, and how are you going to get it, and how are you going to deliver it into your vehicles? That's the challenge, because it's a completely different world to what they're used to. We've been doing diesel for 100 years. That's easy and straightforward. Fleet managers are having to become energy experts in a way that they've never really sort of envisaged.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a good analogy. Yeah, there is a kind of a upskilling, or at least some new skills to add to their profile. Yeah, and maybe a word on the sourcing of the trucks. I mean, how much of a challenge is it today, or is the choice starting to be wide and versatile? How do you see that part of the equation?
Yeah, it's significantly different to where it was 4 or 5 years ago. It really wasn't an option then, but now most OEMs have got a range of vehicles. It's fair to say that the focus of the sort of mainstream brands have been on the sort of heavier end rather than the lighter truck end. That could well be a sort of an unintended consequences of carbon emission sort of reduction targets that they have to achieve, because anything below 16 ton doesn't count to their overall target figures. So there has perhaps been a slight distortion in terms of where their focus is in terms of their portfolio.
Okay.
There are definitely some gaps in the lower end, which is where we're coming in. There's very little choice in the light ton, sort of, the 7.5 ton electric truck market, which is where we're coming in. So,
yeah. So that's the and you explained me when we had the preparation call. So how is it divided, the market, in categories, just to paint the picture for the audience?
Well, I guess essentially, once you're sort of moving out of very large vans, your sort of first trucks are coming. A large van effectively can go up to around about 7 ton, or even 8 ton. But effectively, trucks starts at 7.5 ton. You then see plenty of, and in the UK, 7.5 ton is around about 10% of the overall market. You then got a sort of 12 ton sector, then typically around about 18 ton on a diesel, which is then potentially either a 19 or a 20 ton on an electric. Then you're kind of moving up to sort of 26 ton, and then right up to sort of 40 ton, 42 ton, 44 ton. I mean, at the moment on electric, you can't go up to 44 ton, particularly easily. So yes.
Thank you.
And then you've got some very heavy vehicles beyond that.
That's massive. I mean, it's unbelievable. Yeah. Okay, so if there are two areas of charging which we're particularly interested in at Flexecharge is the public charging, the high power chargers, the en route, and then the depot charging. So maybe you can help us to give a bit of your perspective on, so how does depot charging differ in your view from public fast charging in terms of infrastructure needs, cost, operational efficiency? Yeah, what are the main differences in according to you?
Well, I guess the first difference, certainly from a UK point of view, and this is slightly different to perhaps other countries in Europe, is that there's very little public charging for trucks right now. You can count the number of dedicated truck charging locations on one hand, which that in itself effectively massively restricts the potential for an operator to think about that transition. But that is changing. We're starting to see a number of locations in the plan. So that's the first problem. There really aren't any locations. I guess the big difference really is the fact that if it's depot-based charging rather than public charging, it's under your control. In that sense, the energy costs are undoubtedly going to be cheaper because it's your energy tariff and you are in control of that, and you can then start to negotiate that with your energy supplier. And it's fair to say that that's something that truck operators will need to do. They're buying millions of litres of diesel, and therefore they've probably got very good contracts to supply that diesel. But their energy use to date is probably relatively low in the great scheme of things, and that's going to transform significantly. So there's a real need for them to recognise that, understand the levels of energy that they're going to be requiring, so that they can actually have a sensible conversation with their energy providers to sort of really get the best tariffs that they can. And I guess the real main difference, is the operational efficiency piece, because if you're stopping at a public charger, you've got to fit that into your operational day and to make it work so that it doesn't cost you money. If depot-based charging is very much more in your control, so therefore you're hopefully charging when the vehicle is already naturally sitting on site, loading, or it's just sitting there overnight. So it's a much easier. It's clearly the sort of preferred location. If the truck is already stopped, that's when you charge it.
Yeah, logically, yeah. I wonder how successful the CPOs who are working on public charging, so setting up hubs for more passenger vehicles, how they can be, ramping up their operations to really also service trucks, right? I mean, what is your 2 cents on this? You think, is it a massive challenge, or is it straightforward for them to kind of upgrade?
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I mean, essentially what we're seeing is dedicated truck charging locations as opposed to car charging locations that are being upgraded, should we say. I mean, there certainly will be some blended sites. I mean, you can look at the new, there's a new site, Super Hub, that's been just opened up in Winchester down on the M3 that is a proper blended site just off the M3 that's got lots of cars. It's got spaces for large vans and it's also got some spaces for trucks.
Yeah.
But in reality, we're going to be seeing more of dedicated truck charging locations. The challenge there really is the power that's required from that side of things. So we're very early days in that space, but there's an awful lot going on from a variety of different sort of directions. I mean, you've got sort of OEM. So there's a company called Mylance, which is an OEM collaboration between Volvo, Daimler,
a few of them,
Traton, which is Scania and MAN. Right. They've got a number of locations across Europe already. The first one opened in the UK earlier this year. You've then got the programs under the government zero emission HGV demonstrator program. That's got a huge number of locations planned over the next couple of years. So if we're having this conversation in 2 or 3 years' time, it'll be a different conversation entirely. But it's they are facing big challenges in terms of where's the right place, because it's slightly different to if you're thinking about cars, because cars to some extent has been a bit of a scattergun approach in terms of can you find a location that cars like to go to, and put some charging in, and so you're easily sort of targeting retail sites and everything else, and there's a lot to play with. From a truck perspective, arguably it's more straightforward because they follow to some extent predefined routes, certainly when you're talking about long haul. So you don't have to have quite so many, but you do need to have them in very strategic places so that the truck it's a natural place for the truck to stop. Yes. So they're not going out of their way, because time really is money in trucks.
It is absolutely.
Any time it's spent going off route or off piste, shall we say, and time being spent charging when it would otherwise be driving, it will be costing operators a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's not an option if we want this transition to happen. It has to be competitive and better than combustion engine. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I'm looking forward to see this evolution. I think it goes for all aspects in the ecosystem. Charger companies. I mean, yeah, we see them successfully ramp up. The Kempower, Alpitronics, Hotel. Everybody's going MCS chargers. But could there be new chargers coming out of the blue which are only dedicating to trucks? Maybe. Same goes for backends, CPMS. Could they be dedicated to fleet or to trucks rather than being all around? Yeah, pretty exciting new race that is starting. If we go back to kind of the process of electrifying a fleet, so I really would like to hear your thoughts on. So, what would be the biggest mistakes that companies make when setting up depot charging for their fleets? Typically,
So, I think the biggest mistake that people make is that they don't plan for the endpoint. So, if you've got a depot with 20 trucks. Now that transition to electrify those 20 trucks might be 15 years, from now. But from an infrastructure perspective, excuse me, they're not. I say it's very easy to electrify one truck in the great scheme of things. But the infrastructure requirements and the power requirements and the conversations you've got to have with the energy companies and the energy suppliers is quite different if you're talking about 20 trucks versus one truck. So even if you are not planning on putting that infrastructure in for 5-10 years, you need to be planning for what that infrastructure requirement is going to be and have that conversation with the energy providers for your endpoint. Because what you don't want to be doing is investing an awful lot of money on the basis that you're doing 4 or 5 trucks over the next 2 or 3 years and then realize that actually what you need for the 20 trucks is different, and so therefore you're going to have to start ripping things out, or you haven't had the conversation with the energy supplier to ensure you've got the power supply to the site ready in time. So when you do then come to electrify those trucks, you haven't got the power and you've then got to wait. And the further this goes along, as we start to accelerate this transition, the sort of power grab, if you like, for there's only so much the suppliers and the DNOs can do to actually physically put that power into sites. So if we think that there's challenges today in terms of timescales of getting your site capacity up to scale, that's only going to get worse over time as more and more people start to put demands on the system. So put the plan in today for what you need it to be in 15 years' time. Even if you're not utilizing it, then you will save money, you will save time, and you will definitely have I'm not going to say an easier transition than it could be. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but so yeah, plan for the end point, not what you're about to do right now.
Yeah, so that's a mistake that most would do. Interesting. Any other mistakes you can think of, when you are, again, setting up depot charging? Yeah,
I mean, I guess it's very much thinking about how and when you're going to be using the vehicles, and understanding how much power understanding how much power each individual vehicle is going to need on a given day. They're not every vehicle is going to need to fully charge a whole battery every single time they turn up. Some will, some won't. So really understanding what that charging requirement actually is in terms of charging speeds, and the sort of the management system that goes with that to enable you to sort of really optimize the delivery of the power into your vehicles. I think we might be coming on to a bit more of that later.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's focus a bit on the let's dive deeper into the grid challenges and maybe energy management related issues. Grid constraints are a major concern for high power charging, right? So how do you address grid related issues for depot charging? How do you approach those kind of challenges?
Well, I mean, we're a vehicle supplier in that sense, so it's kind of out of our hands to some extent. But what I will do with what I do with customers is to essentially support them with the people who can help them with that process. There are all sorts of businesses out there with innovative solutions to enable you to sort of mitigate sort of site capacity issues in the short term, whilst you're sort of going through that upgrade process. And those solutions are long-term solutions anyway, which enable you to potentially reduce the power upgrade that you might actually need in the first place. So my role essentially is to try to be the fount of all knowledge, not to help them through that process in terms of that's out of our remit. We're a vehicle supplier, but to enable them to be a facilitator, so that they know where to go to and who to talk to, who can sort of help them with that process. A specialist in that area.
Absolutely, it makes sense. Again, because everybody is, as you said, has to become kind of an energy specialist, right? So we need to help each other, and those who are a bit ahead, those who are a bit more behind. Yeah. So if we related to grid-related issues, we usually, talk a lot about BESS, battery energy storage systems, right, as a solution to peak demand charges or to boost. So how do you see the value of BESS for depot charging today and in the future?
Yeah, I mean, for me, those types of systems are invaluable, really, because they can just help mitigate the capacity issues in that sense. Many depots, when you start to talk about sort of microgrids and this type of thing, in terms of depots have got potentially have large roof spaces, so there's a real opportunity for solar that's feeding into the batteries. Together with batteries being charged sort of at a trickle rate during the day when the power is not required, it just means that it gives you this buffer against the sort of peak demand that you may well be seeing, and enables you to smooth out your sort of energy requirements, which ultimately may mean that, and particularly if you're then factoring in sort of a charging optimization sort of scheduling piece, the real benefit comes from the fact that it's highly likely that it'll reduce the power requirements. When you're talking about a site upgrade or power upgrade to your site, these sort of which inevitably is going to be pretty expensive, and may well not even be possible, or at least will take a very long time. These sort of solutions enable you to reduce the capacity upgrade that you may need, which will then make it cheaper, and B, make it quicker to actually put into place in the first place. So for me, it's a crucial part of the system, really. It just gives you much more energy efficiency and security, and just makes it a much more robust system that you're putting in.
Mm-hmm. And have you seen concrete projects where BESS being installed at depot charging, or is it still on the drawing board?
I think I've not physically seen anything in terms of I've not sort of been around a bit, but it's fair to say that people are doing this and are finding ways to make it work. Trucks. The problem with trucks right now is it really hasn't started. The number of electric trucks on the road right now is fairly small. So we're really at the sort of the early days of this sort of transition process. Yes, there are a sort of a small number of businesses that have sort of made that leap, but really only with a very small number of vehicles in the great scheme of things. So this is something that's going to accelerate, and I fully expect the sort of battery storage and solar on these sort of large sites to accelerate with it, just because it makes it a much more robust system.
Absolutely, yeah, and they have the real estate to put up pretty large solar productions, right? So that's what they have versus other type of sites. Yeah. All right. There's this expression we talk about: charging scheduling optimization, right? So when do you charge? I mean, it's, I guess, obvious answer, but I'd like to hear a bit your take on it. So how can smart energy management solutions help fleet to optimize that charging cost, right? Is it something you discuss again when you are, consulting a bit your customers and with your background?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess there's two elements to sort of charging optimization. One is going back to the power capacity. So if you're putting in a bank of 100 kilowatt chargers for your large trucks, and you plug them all in at the same time, then that peak power is going to be quite high. But if they're not going to be charging all night, or if they're not going to be charging for whatever the period is all together for an extended period, well, then actually, if you're the optimization piece is about going, well, actually, how much energy needs to go into each truck, and actually starting and stopping through the management system the trucks at different times during that, whether it's during the day or overnight, so that actually you really smooth out, can significantly lower that peak power requirement. Now, there may well be a point at which there will always be a peak power moment, but what you're trying to do is to spread that energy requirement over as long a period as possible. Which then comes back to your site capacity requirements and the costs associated with that. If you've got a robust charging scheduling system to optimize that, then that capacity upgrade could well be noticeably different compared to if you're planning based on your peak power of everything plugged in at exactly the same time, and you're running them all. Then it's a different cost calculation.
Very much so, yeah. And to that, would you add also the volatility of the spot price?
Yes,
which is the case in UK, right?
Yeah, completely. And this is where that conversation with your energy suppliers really becomes important, because once you start to understand how much power you need and when do you need it, they can then really work with you to sort of go, well, okay, well, how can we best price this so that you're maximizing or rather minimizing the sort of tariff implications. There are some real. There's some real low points in terms of pricing, and so if you can optimize your charging at those times and have that conversation with your provider, then you can really sort of really drive the prices down on your energy costs.
Yeah, when the wind is blowing on the coast of England. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, if we dive a bit into business models and maybe profitability related issues. So again, given your background and the conversation you're having with customers, so what business models do you see emerging for depot charging? Should the operators own their charging infrastructure or work with third-party providers? I think there's a big question, a crossroads saying, okay, I'm going to delegate that to a CPO who really knows also depot charging, even though they're not going to sell electricity because it's a CPO. It's not even maybe my utility, right? It's really a third-party CPO moving in, or do I run it up myself?
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's no right answer to that.
No.
Or there's no one answer to that. One size definitely doesn't fit all. And so it really comes down to appetite for risk, I guess. How cash rich you are as a business in that sense. I mean, there are different models. I mean, essentially, I guess there are three main models that you might sort of want to sort of consider. One is, yes, you own it yourself, and that's it. It's your investment. The second is effectively you fund it through a leasing sort of mechanism, if you like. And then the third is a slightly more interesting one, which is sort of the pay per mile or pay per kilometer sort of scenario, where the supplier pays for the infrastructure, is then connected into that energy supply, and then essentially that you are paying per kilometer for that you're or potentially paying per kilowatt, but it's an enhanced kilowatt price to sort of build into the infrastructure cost. So there are different ways of looking at it, and what is best for an individual organization is very much determined by how do they like to spend their money, I guess, in that sense.
Absolutely.
And the cost of money to them. So, I mean, if it's a relatively cash-rich business, then actually, yes, you probably would want to pay for it yourself. But others that actually would rather put that investment into other elements of their sort of core business than some sort of funding model of which there are. And I think this area is going to be quite interesting in terms of development, in terms of, because that investment is significant. I think it's, without understating it, it's a significant investment now. And when you're talking a large number of particularly large trucks, then you're talking a very significant investment to sort of put this infrastructure in. For many operators, that's just a bill that they can't face up front. And that in many ways is one of the biggest barriers to sort of this transition. Forget whether or not the vehicle will do the job or not, just the physical cost of that infrastructure. Bearing in mind the trucks themselves are significantly more expensive than the diesel equivalent, particularly when you're talking the sort of top end trucks. So a funding model is arguably a much more attractive way for many operators to sort of make this an accessible transition. Which funding model is best suited is very much down to the operator, but I think we'll increasingly see a growth in more innovative ways of paying for that infrastructure and that energy and wrapping it all together. And potentially, there are people talking as truck as a service. So you're actually wrapping everything into that monthly payment, including the cost of the truck as well. Because if you're sitting there facing a £250,000 price tag for a truck, and you're wanting to do 10 trucks, then actually, if you can wrap in the infrastructure, wrap in the energy, and do the whole thing as a truck as a service, and whatever that monthly payment is, then that becomes quite an interesting conversation. There will be a growth. There will be a growth in that sort of in innovative ways of funding the whole package, if you like, and menu picking which bits you want.
I think that one of the recent examples, I think that's the way they're going with the new joint venture between is it Renault and Volvo with the Flexis, the platform, right? Those new vehicles on the single platform there, where they're also trying to really bring holistic solutions. Where I guess you would see in the end it's a truck as a service, or van as a service in this case, right? Because it's not trucks. So absolutely, it's and again here I'm also very excited by the perspective of again upskilling, people and new positions. People being recruited to work for a logistics company, being energy specialists, energy traders, electricity traders. You would say, they had until now people trading the fuel, I guess, but it doesn't require as many manpower than it does to run really operations of charging and energy management, right? And all the revenues associated to it also. And that's a transition to the technology innovation, right? Where we're going. So what innovations, let's talk about innovation, do you see shaping the future of depot charging, right? What would you mention?
So there's a question. So I think autonomy or autonomous technology has a great opportunity here, partly because if autonomous vehicles, if your whole fleet has an autonomous capability to it, so you turn up at the depot as the driver, you get out of the vehicle at the sort of the front of the depot and press the button and off the truck goes. Or even the bus, if we're talking about depots, then buses sort of fall into this category as well. A huge amount of bus damage happens in depot as they're manoeuvring around, not on the streets. It's all happening in the depot because large vehicles in a relatively confined space. So if you've got autonomous vehicles, then just from a pure space perspective, you can fit more vehicles in the same space. From a parking perspective, because you haven't got to get out the doors, basically. And an autonomous vehicle can park it, in principle, more precisely than a driver, so you can fit more vehicles in. But it also then means you then start to sort of get interesting concepts about, robot charging and actually sort of the whole charging system, coming back to this optimization piece of how and when you're charging your vehicles. It's all very well having scheduled charging where one vehicle starts charging and another vehicle stops charging, but that still requires all those vehicles to be plugged in at the same time, which basically means in principle, you've got more chargers than you need. So you might have resolved the sort of site capacity sort of power problem, but you have had to invest in more chargers than you actually need because all the vehicles are turned up, they've been plugged in, and yes, it's been scheduled for sort of that overnight charge, but you've still got all the vehicles plugged in at the same time. The only alternative to that is to have people employed to move trucks around. So if you then sort of move into the sort of space of autonomous vehicles and sort of robot charging applications, well, then suddenly you can have you could potentially have less charges in a smaller space and have your vehicles sort of moving around and plugging them in themselves. There's the system plugging them in and that charging being optimized. So we're a little way away from that, but I think that would be the sort of most interesting piece from a sort of depot charging perspective, is actually sort of combining those two things together.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, that's quite futuristic. I can see this real ballet of big machines moving around very swiftly, just passing each other by millimeters because it's all controlled by machines, right? Yeah. A bit like you see those parking lots where you are just putting your car and then it just gets down and then they're packed so close. It's a bit the same. Yeah, you would optimize the space, optimize timing, everything would talk together. Yeah, with the one big brain. Yeah. That's interesting.
And in principle, we're not that far away from it. The technology is there. The autonomous technology is there. It's perfectly capable of doing it. It's more a question of the OEMs building that in and recognizing it and seeing the real value to that. So I can see it happening. It's not going to happen in the next 5 minutes, but I can see it happening.
Yeah. But it could actually first happen on the depot themselves, where it's a closed area, where you say, again, then before you get the authorization to be autonomous on the road, on the public road, you could at least be autonomous within the big depot area where you really have those machines running, driving around themselves. Yeah, that's quite a funky view. Yeah. And a last note on what's your an area that of course excites us is so V2G, right? The buzzword number one. So again, sending the energy back to the grid. So how do you see that innovation impacting depot charging, if that could be really up and running finally at some point?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly when you're talking about larger trucks, I guess to some extent, so in principle, yes, there's a great opportunity for any commercial vehicle, depot-based commercial vehicle, to be essentially sort of moving that energy in and out. The vehicles very rarely come back empty. If vehicles, vans are probably typically coming back at sort of the end of the day when energy prices are at peak costs, and there's every chance they'll have 20-30% left of their battery left. So actually, yes, if we start pushing that energy in, and then you schedule it to be charged up later on, there's a huge opportunity to be sort of maximizing these mobile battery storage units in effect, and helping stabilize the grid, and generating money for the operator. I guess there is a question mark around battery degradation. If you're essentially significantly increasing the energy going in and out, the charging cycles, in that sense, in terms of will that accelerate battery degradation and accelerate sort of the end of life for those vehicles? In principle, it does. You see, I mean, I'm certainly not a battery chemist. I'm certainly not a battery specialist, and I hear both sides. There are plenty of people who sort of say, well, it really won't be a problem, and there are plenty of people who say it really will be a problem if you're doing an awful lot of that bi-directional and significantly increasing the charging cycle activity. Then we may well see an increased degradation. But I guess that's one of those things we'll wait and see what happens. Really.
Exactly, remains to be seen. Yeah.
But in theory, there's a huge opportunity there. There's an awful lot of vehicles with an awful lot of battery capacity that could well be utilized at real peak times of the day.
I think, yeah, exactly. You could say it mirrors, the same way you said it's a substantial investment up front, or that has to be made, it will be also massive potential incomes that are connected to it. I mean, that's something we definitely see when we look in our crystal ball. Yeah. Right. Well, I think, on that note, I think we could keep on for a long time, but I think I gotta let you go and back to work. Thanks a lot to David for taking some time to be in the hot seat of the ChargePoint podcast. And wishing you a fantastic afternoon and nice weekend. It's Friday when we record this. And, looking forward to keeping in touch and following how Pelican is doing.
Yes, indeed. Look out for our launch in a couple of months' time.
Exciting. We'll follow that closely. Take care. Thank you, David.
Thanks very much. Cheers. Bye now.
And that's a wrap for this first episode in our depot and fleet charging series on the ChargePoint podcast. Huge thanks again to Casper Norden from Decade Energy and David Watts from Pelican Engineering for sharing their sharp insights today. Here's what stood out to me. From Casper, we learned that the real bottleneck in fleet electrification isn't just about having electric trucks, it's about getting enough reliable power to the depots. Casper showed us that smart infrastructure planning, innovative financing, and a deep understanding of depot operations are now critical pillars to decarbonizing commercial transport. His message: secure your power today or risk being left behind tomorrow. And from David, we heard a candid reality check. While electrifying one truck is easy, scaling it across a fleet demands serious operational, technical, and financial planning. Depot-based charging is the logical path forward because it brings control, cost efficiency, and predictability. But, and it's a big but, without enough power, your fleet electrification dreams could stall fast. His advice? Start thinking like an energy manager, not just like a fleet manager. Think about that. Both conversations made one thing crystal clear. Depot charging isn't just a technical challenge, it's a strategic one. It's about rethinking energy, operations, and investments all at once. And this is just the beginning. Get ready for more episodes in the coming month, where you'll hear more from innovators helping to solve these challenges. And if you found today's insight valuable, make sure you subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode with the network. Until next time, keep charging forward.